Somebody who's been in psychosynthesis and doing the work in spiritual psychology and soul process work for a long time, and then bringing to the forefront somebody who's pretty new to psychosynthesis and hearing from both ends of that spectrum. And Dee Dee talked about legacy work. So this really brings that into focus today. And it's really exciting for me to be up here because people have been saying, you know, you're it now. It's like tag in the language of psychosynthesis. We all trained for a long time. Tag, you're it. We're just gonna watch now. But I've gotten a lot of support from a lot of people to make the transition and to keep things going at the Synthesis Center. But today I've got one of my most important and earliest teachers here, Tom Yeomans, and one of the first students in our online program, Angel Santiago. So it's really fun for me to be between these two people and to be standing here with them. The other thing that's really exciting today, if you see a lot of, there's always a lot of hugging at a psychosynthesis conference, of course, but because we now have these online training programs, people stare at me for a little bit, they act like they really know me, and in fact they do know me. They've known me for 2 years, but today's the first day that we've met. So people are meeting because, right, Val? And I'm like, I didn't know you'd look like that. I know a lot about your life and your challenges and your kid and your dreams, but like here you are. So it's so exciting. People have come from Vancouver and Texas and Florida and Massachusetts, and people are meeting not only the folks from the Synthesis Center, but also each other. So thank you all for coming from near and far to be together in this new generation, which includes online training. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by turning the floor over to Tom, and he's going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes. He's going to tell you what he intends to talk about in his work, and then we'll switch it over, and Angel will talk from his perspective about psychosynthesis and how he's looking at things. We'll then have some time for questions and conversation amongst the group, and that's kind of how we envision.
I thought you were going to interview us too.
And I might ask them some questions as well myself as moderator. We'll see. All right, so Tom hardly needs an introduction. I will anyway say Tom is the founder and director of the Concord Institute and a co-founder of the International School Postgraduate Training Institute in St. Petersburg, Russia. He studied at Harvard, Oxford, and University of California, and has done professional work in the fields of literature, education, and psychology. Since 1970, he's been a psychotherapist, teacher, and trainer for people studying throughout North America, Europe, and Russia. He's also done a prolific amount of writing. He has also published in psychosynthesis and spiritual psychology, several volumes of poetry, and a children's book. I also know Tom as a painter and a musician, and enjoy both of his creative pursuits. And he still maintains a private practice in soul process guiding and mentoring, and has his office now in Coleraine. He's out in the country. Shelburne Falls. They live in Coleraine, but the office is in Shelburne Falls. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom, and you can kind of take it from there and say where you're going to go.
Now, I'm wired, so I can't stand up. But I'm wondering, can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
You can? Okay. Okay, good. So, you know, my job is as the archivist, the historian. And I actually want to tell you some early history that you don't know about psychosynthesis, and then some about the early days. The topic of my little talk is the early days of psychosynthesis in North America. But I want to start with Roberto Assagioli, who was very, very far ahead of his time. And he, as creative and gifted people often are, was very lonely in his work. And his wife, Nella, was worried about that, and because Assagioli would be so lonely that he would hook up with any group he could find. And he hooked up with some pretty weird groups over the time. But that's only to say that he was very gifted and very lonely in his vision, and his vision is very comprehensive. And you know the story of him departing from Freud and being a colleague of Jung, and as he said to Freud, there's more to human life than the basement. And he was certainly one of the innovators in introducing the notion of the higher self within a psychological context. So in the 50s, he came once to the United States, 1957, and he founded the Psychosynthesis Research Foundation in New York City. And this was it was on 40th Street, and it was run by a very thrifty Scotsman called Frank Hilton. And they set this up for research purposes, and there was a little group of people, of Jungian analysts and psychologists who met monthly, and they presented papers to each other. It was scholarly, it was small, and but it was a step. It was the first step into North America. Okay? The other thing that happened in the 60s was that Assagioli discovered Maslow, Abraham Maslow, and they had a correspondence. They began to correspond with each other. And he was very excited about humanistic psychology. He felt that in Maslow's work, he was finally finding a kindred spirit. And I think part of his coming to America, I don't know if he met Maslow, but he began to have a feeling there was something happening in America that was kindred to what he was trying to do. So the book Psychosynthesis was published in 1965. So that's mid-60s. And in the late 60s, there began to be quite, in California mostly, a revolution, explosion of therapeutic modalities and what was called the human potential movement. And it rose out of Maslow's work and Alport's work, and some of those early humanistic psychologists, but it was very experiential, and it was implicitly spiritual. And there was in Esalen Institute was the epicenter of this movement, and there was a wide range of modalities and a huge amount of experimentation, and a lot of it was a little on the crazy side, but it was a marvelous flowering of this, basically this question, there's more to the human being than the unconscious or than the behavior, that there's an inner experience, there's an experience, you can give people's experience, you can work with experience, there's a soul, there are deep feelings, there's body work, I mean, everything began to explode at that time. And the Esalen leaders, who were very wonderful but somewhat proud people because they were at the epicenter of the whole thing, would sneak secretly over to visit Assagioli. They didn't want anyone to know because they didn't want anyone to know that there was someone higher than them. But they went and they came back, and the most important person in terms of that was Mike Murphy, who had started Esalen. And he went in the late 60s to Italy and studied with Assagioli, and he came back and said, psychosynthesis will integrate the human potential movement. So he responded to the comprehensive vision of Assagioli and said, let's see if we can bring this very, very large framework as a way to integrate and cohere all these different things that are happening. So that was a very exciting idea. And in January of 1971, Esalen hosted a presentation of psychosynthesis to this growing population of people who were doing this work. And I wasn't at that time, but I was very excited to see that. And I was thinking, what happened was comparable to, from 1970 on, from that point, what happened in psychosynthesis and generally in the human potential movement, particularly psychosynthesis, would be comparable to the technological explosion that's happening now. This was an incredible explosion in consciousness studies. People came from all over, came from Europe, came from the East Coast to Esalen, and eventually the institute that we started, and there were other institutes as well, to learn psychosynthesis and to, given, not that Mike Murphy was behind all this, but I think his giving it his blessing really made psychosynthesis very visible, and there was a huge response. And by 1975, the institute that we were in San Francisco, we were flying all over the country teaching psychosynthesis to people 30 years older than us. We were kids. Most of us were in our 20s, Ann and I were in our early 30s. We were kids. Suddenly we had this powerful tool that people wanted. And I remember coming to New York and teaching in a New York hotel on the Avenue of the Americas to 200 people who were psychiatrists and psychologists. And here I'm standing up there holding daffodils, and talking about the soul. We were very brave. And I want to portray to you the excitement of that time. It was explosive. And psychosynthesis was right in the vanguard. There were other institutes. There was High Point Foundation, which had training programs up and down the West Coast. There was a center in New York started. There were centers starting all over the place. The work that people came from Europe to study with us and then took the material back. And it was funny, I was teaching in Sweden about 30 years later, and someone said, "Do you know this transcript called Helen and the Witch?" And I said, "Sure, we used that transcript 30 years ago in San Francisco." And it was still being used in Sweden. So it was explosive in the same way that technology. Consciousness was really in the foreground. And there was this feeling coming out of the new potential movement, humanistic psychology, we can change from the inside. We can take control of our life, we can change from the inside, we can grow. And psychosynthesis was holding that vision. There were also some early rivalries. And at exactly the same time, the Association for Transpersonal Psychology was starting. And there's another set of letters between Assagioli and Tony Sudich, who started the Transpersonal Organization, as to which discipline was bigger. It's like, it sounds male, doesn't it? Yeah, it's like, does psychosynthesis fit within transpersonal psychology, or does transpersonal psychology fit within psychosynthesis? So there began to be wars between these different disciplines. And again, it's so interesting because you could count on your hands and feet, and maybe a few more, the number of people who were involved at the beginning. We all knew each other, but we did to some degree choose different camps and different disciplines. And there were some terrible things that came out of that. But there was competition, there was disagreement as really how to work with the spiritual dimension and so forth. But the main thing I want to portray is it's just tremendous amount of excitement. Now, there was probably too much excitement. And in our case, in San Francisco, I think our group fell apart in a very disastrous way. And it was partly because we were way overextended. We didn't really know what we were doing, and there were some darker elements in our personalities that really took over and pretty much destroyed that institute. So with this burst from 1970, by 1980, this institute had collapsed, and that sent shockwaves through the whole psychosynthesis world, not only in North America, but also in Europe. And without going into the details of that, that's an important part of the history, and I want to put a positive spin on it. It was very, very painful to have a group that powerful fall apart, but it was very, very useful to learn about the dark sides of spiritual life and what can go wrong in individuals and in groups. So in a sense, it deepened psychosynthesis in a very, very painful way, but still in a useful way. So the 80s were really, for those of us who stayed, a lot of people left, said, "To hell with this, I never want to teach psychosynthesis again," and some of us stayed and picked up the pieces. And the 80s was really filled with people reconnecting with each other. And it was beautiful to see, because people had really been hurt by this event. And yet everybody wanted to come back together. So there were conferences, there were summer institutes, there were books published, and there were countless phone calls. And I made a lot of those calls to people who were alienated and say, "Will you come? Will you come back? Come to this conference." And people would come and they'd find each other. And that process actually went on for about 20 years. In fact, we just heard yesterday from Jan that Doug Russell, who lives in Los Angeles, was one of the persons who was sort of cast off, learned about the quarterly and wants to edit it. So there's also been a very long process of healing in this community. And it's going beautifully. As I said to Anne, well, this is taking a little longer than we thought. But it's happening. And then a next generation came in, this so-called smaller centers. So there was one in Kentucky. Vincent Dummer's done a tremendous amount of good work. There were different centers that recovered from the shock and began to really, and Dee Dee is a case in point. She said, I'm going to Emerson, I'm doing my own thing. And that empowered Dee Dee to have everything that's happened here today. So again, the crisis was good, people stood on their own, and from that standing on their own, they related to each other. So the 80s and 90s have been a recovery and a blossoming, but I think the thing to think about also, how am I doing on time?
You got about 5 more minutes.
Okay. What happened was also during that time, the psychological culture changed. Consciousness fell away, and a much more pragmatic orientation came in. Cognitive behavioral therapy, the various, body work techniques, trauma work, addiction work. I mean, there was a huge differentiation of psychological thought and practice in the 80s and 90s. It was very, very exciting. But the energy was going to that. It didn't continue to hold that larger context. And psychosynthesis really was kind of sidelined. And I think that it served still a small number of people, but in terms of its potential as the integrating force in the human potential movement, it wasn't able to do that. And I think it's also that in this country, it came out of the counterculture and encountered the split between the traditional culture and the counterculture. And the pragmatic people, who were also spiritual, found ways and language to be part of the pragmatic mainline establishment culture. Psychosynthesis didn't find that in most cases. It stayed with the counterculture, consciousness-oriented, focus. And I think that's one of the challenges now, is that there has to be another way to go forward than in just working with consciousness. And that's this, this conference is about that, so I'm not going to talk about that. But only to say that in the 80s and 90s, it was weakened. And even though people were coming back together, it wasn't bringing large numbers of people in. And centers started closing, and we're down to one center in North America now, essentially. In the 70s, there were 15, 20 training centers, and with full programs and so forth. And they all gradually died in different ways. So this really is a point of renewal. And the question really is, and Angel's going to answer this.
No pressure.
And when I say weakened, I only mean that it just went through a period of decline and healing at the same time. I just call it convalescence. Convalescence. So there's plenty of energy here. And the next generation is here. And technology is here. I mean, I've taught in St. Petersburg, Russia, from my office in Shelburne Falls. I've taught in New Zealand from Shelburne Falls. This is something I couldn't have done 20 years ago. So the technology is at our disposal. There's the next generation, and there's still this comprehensive vision that Assagioli held and was very lonely with. Now there are lots of people holding it. There are lots of people holding it. There's a spiritual hunger. There are people who are traditionally trained or even trained in alternative ways who come looking still for this connection. So rightly packaged, as Assagioli would say, he used that term, can you believe it? He says it's all a matter of packaging. He said to Anthony, you'll have plenty of work. It's all a matter of packaging. So the question I want to leave you with, and Angel too, is how do we package this now so it really is relevant to what's happening in the culture and to the language of the culture, the concerns of the culture, climate change, racism, income inequity, social issues, political issues, and how do we bring a deep spiritual orientation to those issues? And they're also global now. They're not, they're no longer national. So in some ways, psychosynthesis in North America is I don't know what you say, but it's obsolete in the sense it really is a global movement now and a global need for what we understand, and it really is just a matter of packaging. So that's what the old man says.
So we are going to hear next from Angel. I'm just going to say a couple of words of introduction. When we approached Angel to ask him to be one of the speakers, and thinking about the movement of psychosynthesis over time, and what has it been for him that drew him into this work, he had sort of an interesting response, I thought, because he thought and reflected back to us that maybe we could look at the process of how do we reinvent ourselves. So think about that in your life. How have you reinvented yourself? What do we know about that process? Because we've all had to do it. We left home when we went off to college. We started a family. We left and started a new life after that. We traveled. We've done different things in our lives. We've all had to reinvent ourselves. And maybe we do that every day. So just on that whole theme of how do we reinvent ourselves, what would that then tell us about how does psychosynthesis reinvent itself? If we understand what are sort of the important elements of that. And that's a question for all of us to think about. What does it mean for psychosynthesis to be relevant in this time? So how many people here are new to psychosynthesis within the last 5 years? Raise your hand. So look around the room. So what drew you here? And what do you imagine it's going to mean to reinvent psychosynthesis? And we had some really dynamic talks at the Great Montreal Conference that Jan coordinated, and a bunch of folks came to the senior trainers meeting and talked, and here's our new ideas, and here's our questions. So thank you all for coming, and Angel is going to give us one message about why it's relevant to him now and how he might see psychosynthesis being reinvented. So Angel, psychosynthesis life coach, he's an ordained minister. He's from San Antonio. He does public speaking. We know him as a salsa dancer from YouTube, and actually had his own professional dance troupe that toured all around internationally, Puerto Rico, Latin America, and Europe. He's a professional salsa dancer. Angel was in the U.S. Army as a respiratory therapist. He graduated from University of Texas, San Antonio, is that right? With a BA in electronic media and technical communication. This was the other thing that happened at the Montreal conference. All of a sudden, we were all over Facebook at that conference. And we were out having drinks by the waterfront, and the next day it's all over Facebook and their friends. And all their friends from all over the country, and they have, like Dee Dee and I, we probably have like 60 Facebook friends combined. All these people are like, where are you? It seems so cool. And we're all posting. So we just were immediately online. We've learned about, what is it, Dee Dee? Periscope? It's live streaming. In fact, are we live streaming?
Right now.
Hey everybody! People all over Angel's network and elsewhere are watching this right now. So it's a new era, and Angel has helped bring that along with Marjorie and everybody else who's helped us out with technology. I also love the end of this bio, so I have to read it. Angel's the proud, active father of a beautiful 6-year-old daughter. He's an incredible guy. In that way, currently training to be a spiritual director. His last sentence I love. Angel's biggest accomplishment is now his own life. Balanced, joyful, and overflowing with love and the daily magic of life.
Well, first I'm going to talk to you about a story called a miracle transformation. So there's a pilgrim boy and his father. They're going to visit a mall for the first time. And they're so impressed and so mesmerized by everything. They're going up and down the escalators over and over and over again. I mean, they're looking at the people shopping, the stores. But there was one thing that really caught their attention. And it was these 2 shiny silver walls that would kind of they would pull apart from each other and then come back together. And they would pull apart together and come back together. And the son was like, Father, what is this? He said, son, I have no idea. I have never seen this in my entire life. And then an older woman in a wheelchair comes by, pushes the button, and goes into this wall into what appeared to be a small room. And they see that some time goes by, and then the walls open again, and this beautiful young 24-year-old child. And this guy's like, son, go get your mother. Talk about instant transformation. But, you know, it doesn't happen that way. But what I like to do today is talk to you guys about, you know, reinvention, really. And how does that apply to psychosynthesis? And before I say that, I just want to say that I'm really, really thankful, you know, and honestly blessed to be here, because it wasn't, I think it was 9 months ago that we went to the Montreal conference, and I was sitting right where you are, and I was looking at people like Tom and Massimo give this talks, and I was so impressed by it all. And I remember thinking at that moment, I was like, I want to do that one day. But I didn't know it would happen this fast, so I'm very grateful for my teachers, Dee and John. It's the door.
He was only 12 when we met.
Wait till they go again.
I know. I get younger, but no, but you know, Dee and John they offered me this opportunity. I almost like fell out of my chair, you know. I really did, and just to be here next to you, it's just wow. I mean, it's like a dream come true, honestly. So thank you. So going back to the talk, you know, about reinvention. You know, reinvention means change. You know, change means reinvention, but that doesn't mean that you have to create a completely different person. You know, could it be that it just means that you're going to look within yourself and look what has always been there and will always be there, and enhance it, expand it, grow it. You know, really bring it forth. You know, you're going to look at those gifts and talents that you have within yourself. You're going to bring that to the world. You know, it's a process that takes place, and they say that those who adapt succeed. But I find that it's not just adapting that it's going to help you. It is adapting without losing your essence, without losing, again, what has always been there. I'm going to go back to about 5 years to the date. I was, you know, me and my wife were having a lot of problems. We were arguing up left and right, and I always knew we would be okay as long as we didn't argue when it came to dance choreography. We always found that place to be like, okay, we're good. But then we were arguing even about dance choreography. I was like, okay, something's wrong. You know, this is not normal. And she told me something about, after a long argument, she said, you know, I think we need to separate. You know? And that flipped my world upside down. I mean, everything I knew to that point was ending. You know, I was shocked. I didn't know what to do. I felt lost. I felt alone. I felt not loved. I felt not wanted. And one of the things I had to do was, what do I do now? and what came out of it was that I didn't know who I was. That's really what it boiled down to. I didn't know who I was. I was really living my life according to what other people wanted me to live, or what somebody else told me, or for her, for that matter, you know. And so I didn't know who I was. And so I had to make a decision. I was going to get to know who I was. I was going to go through that process, and that experience of losing my wife was the catalyst for my journey of change and transformation at that moment. And it was 5 years ago. But in order for that to work, I had to do something that I had never done before. And for me, that was looking within. I had to go in, look at my heart, look at my essence, sit in silence, and just really go in. Because up to that point, I was always looking for something outside of me, for a solution for an internal problem. And that wasn't going to help me. You know? And so I made a vow at that moment that if she didn't want me, if she didn't love me, that I would want me, that I would love me, that I would make me a priority. You know, that's what I had to do. And I had to give myself the love and kindness that I was really seeking from her, or from anybody else for that matter. I just decided to give it to myself. And so my journey went on. I began to notice these little gifts, these little talents, these little qualities that were unique to me and that nobody else could replicate. And I started to notice those things. And I started to feel like a calling to want to share that with other people, you know? And so I asked myself, I told myself, what if I enhance and expand these gifts? If I really look in there and bring them forth? And if I keep shutting down my eyes and my ears to the outside world, and I really continue to connect with my inner spirit, like what would happen? If I listen to that voice within, would I find peace? Would I find purpose, meaning, value? Right? Would I heal? And if I did, could I then help other people do the same thing? Those are some of the questions that I had asked myself. And so I was looking at my life, and I had to understand that the world around me was changing, right? And I understood that everything has changed. That the universe is in a constant state of motion, always moving, always moving, always moving. What I realized was to truly, live my life, like the art of living is really in the constantly being, like adjusting yourself. Constantly adjusting yourself, Charles Darwin said that it's not the strongest or the most intelligent people that, that are going to survive or going to succeed. It's those that can adapt to change the best, So that's kind of what I was doing, And what I did is I started connecting with my story, all of it, all of my story. I had to connect with who I was, who I am. And in order for me to really change or reinvent myself or grow, I had to let go of who I thought I was. Every concept, every paradigm, anything that was a concept, I had to let it go. I had to let it go. Because up to that point, all it was doing was it had limited me. It took me to where I was, but then I found myself not knowing who I am. So it was really, it wasn't producing a desirable result. Those thoughts, those concepts that I had. And so literally, I was really walking right off the edge of my maps. That's what I had to do. And so I started exploring, trying and doing new and different things. I mean, how else I was going to know if it was going to work if I didn't try different things, if I didn't explore, if I didn't experiment. I had to be very present with what was emerging, with what was unfolding at every moment of my life. And so I made a choice. I made a choice to not stay in the struggle. I made a choice to not suffer anymore. But instead, to see an opportunity to not reinvent myself, but it was really an opportunity to reinvent my life. It was to find a new way of thinking or a new process of how I'm going to live my life. And so I started to design my life. I created a new vision for my life, for my future, one that was more in tune with that true self, and one that would support who I was becoming and who I wanted to become. But in order to do that, I had to connect with a why. What's my why for doing all this? And I mean a why that's much bigger than me, way, way bigger than me, that went beyond me. I had to find a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, something that kind of like gave me the sense that I'm on a mission here. I want to connect with that. And so, like most of us, that has to do with helping other people. Helping other people and make a positive impact in their lives. But how could I do that? I first had to do that with myself. I had to connect with myself. I had to change myself. I had to make a positive impact in my life first. If I was really truly going to do that, or help anybody else do the same thing. Once I was able to identify my why, I honestly believe that we all have the same purpose. We spend so much time and energy. What is my purpose? What is my purpose? What is my purpose? But we all have the same purpose. I said it a minute ago. It's helping each other grow and be better. Now, what I needed to find was my how. How was I going to do that? How was I going to help other people? So yours may be different than mine, or it may come in different clothes. But it's the same. It's the same purpose. So once I identified that, it required that I had discernment. It meant that I had to say, okay, I had to ask myself a few questions. For example, I had to declutter my life. Is this job that I'm working at right now, is it helping me get to my purpose, right? Or is it giving me the money and the resources to get to my purpose, right? What about any other decision that I had to make after that? Is this helping me get there? Is this giving me the time or the freedom to get to my purpose? And the same with the people that I was bringing into my life, or that I already had in my life. Are these people helping me get there, or are they not? And if the answer was no, then I just didn't do it. Because it would go against my why. It would go against my vision. It would go against who I was becoming. It would go against who I am. Lastly, I wanted to be remarkable. I really did. I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting that, But that meant that I had to be vulnerable. That meant that I had to accept my story who I was, who I am, who I'm becoming. And I had to humble myself to share it and to live it out loud. You know, they say that those things that make you great are the things that you hide the most. Those are the things that are going to make you great. So I had to just share it, you know, that it wasn't an embarrassment. You know? Even though it was painful, it wasn't an embarrassment. And I had to realize that, you know, that I had to make myself relevant in order to do that. That's why I connected with them. You know, I started to go to school. I started learning more. I started reading, you know. I had to make myself, I had to be authentic. Really, that's what it really boiled down to. I had to be authentic, be true to myself, and be an evolving person all the time. And now, why does all that matter, right? Because I feel that the same process that we go through to reinvent ourselves can be applied to organizations, right? There's a quote by the chairman and CEO of Starbucks that says that the most powerful and enduring brands are built from the heart. They are real and sustainable. The companies that are lasting are those that are authentic. And that's exactly what I did. That's exactly what we have to do, is become authentic. So why couldn't psychosynthesis incorporate that process and have it connect with its story, right? Be ever present with what's emerging today, which was unfolding today for psychosynthesis, to look inside its own heart, into its essence, and bring forth those gifts and talents and enhance them and expand them, right? In order to create a new vision for the future. Recognizing that times have changed, just like Tom said, there's technology now, right? And possibly the audience has changed as well, you know? And so if that's the case, psychosynthesis will have to also try different and new things that it's never done before to see what's really going to work, to connect with people now, people today. I say let's be more like the fashion industry, right? And here's why. The fashion industry is always evolving, right? It's always changing. It's always adjusting to emerging trends. Oftentimes, it creates the trends, right? There's a story about, does anybody know who Zara is? The store Zara, right?
Yeah.
They're like the biggest retailer in fashion, the world's leading retailer in fashion. And Zara has a story about innovation. They decided that they were going to develop a dialogue with their customers, right? It wasn't going to be Zara telling their customer, here, this is what you want to wear. It was the customers telling Zara what they want to wear. And what they did is very simple. They create about 5 outfits of each kind and then send it to the stores. There's not very much stock either. You know, it's just a few. And what happens is they start to look at what the customers are buying and not buying. And then they begin to notice that the managers at the stores, they ask, well, what do you like about it? I say, well, I like this dress, I like this color, I just don't like that strap down the middle. Or I don't like zippers on those pants by the ankles. And the managers are taking notes. All the managers are taking notes. And at the end of the day, they send those notes to headquarters. Headquarters then sends it to their designers. And they immediately get rid of that strap down the middle of that dress. They get rid of those zippers on those pants and send those back out to get done, and then 5 more go to the stores, right? But Zara didn't have to create a new product or create a new company to become the world's leading fashion retailer. They just created a new process. That's all they did. So basically, you know, and the reason I share that is because I wanted to illustrate the fact that we have to be relevant, like you mentioned, and we have to be adaptable, right? And if we want to do that, we have to connect with our story, right? We have to connect with, and our story is really our strategy. If we don't have a clear, articulated story, then how could we're not going to have a clear and thought out organization. You know, our story would tell people who we are and why we exist. And so I want to ask you, let's apply the both and model to psychosynthesis, right? So the next generation doesn't mean erase and start over, right? The history counts, just like Tom just shared with us. Our history counts. It's what has made psychosynthesis what it is today. So let's transcend it and include it, right? Let's make it. Let's use what made it strong, what made it reliable and last this long, and let's expand it. Let's enhance it. Let's use that history. Let's streamline our identity so that we can become more efficient and more effective. Let's become a single unified force in the U.S. and work together. There's places like the AAP that we could use as a vehicle to help us do this, right? To become a single unified force in the United States. Let's revitalize who we are. Let's do the psychosynthesis what psychosynthesis was created for, right? A process of personal growth. A way to harmonize or synthesize our various aspects, right? Let's help psychosynthesis reach its fullest realization of itself, so that we can be relevant in a changing society, so that we can be the trendsetters of our industry, and so that we can be remarkable. And before I end, I want to share a quote from an author named Dave Redbard. He said, "The journey of reinvention is one of raw emotions, emerging from dormancy, surprising as a paper cut, overwhelming as a hailstorm, one part vulnerability, one part rage, one part surrender, uncomfortable, unfamiliar, unsure, fearful, alone, damaged, broken, finding a new self, slowly, different, healing, humble, present, open, longing, and free." We all know that evolution is inevitable. It's a process that begins because there is a growing need for change. And if we continue to operate the way we operated when we first launched, then we're going to be stagnant. And that means we're not growing. And I know you all know that it's not an easy process, but it's a very rewarding one. And no one knows what we need to do better than ourselves, the people that are here, that are working in this industry. So if we can trust in that knowing, if we can stay true to who we are, if we can look into our hearts, in our essence, and work together, then success is going to flow to us very easily. And so I ask, what is unfolding and what is emerging for psychosynthesis today? Can we take a look at its inner talents and its gifts? Can we enhance them and expand them in any way? How might psychosynthesis express them more fully, with more trust and confidence, so it can reach its full potential? I, for one, am very optimistic and excited to answer those questions. And I want us to remember our history and learn from it. But I also want to invite you to imagine the possibilities of working together to create a new tomorrow. Thank you.
Wow, that took us all across a wide spectrum. So we have about 10 minutes plus a little more left in this part of the day. So I want to turn it right over to the audience rather than me just asking them questions. So anything that got stirred for you, came alive in you, could be a question for one or both of them. So just feel free, if somebody's got something, just let us know, and we'll just take as many as we can. We'll go around the room. Let's start over here, and we'll sweep across. Julia.
Thank you both. It's really, really great to hear you speak. And I'll just take this moment quickly. I quoted you a fair bit in my thesis, so it's really neat to meet you.
Could you speak up, please?
Sure.
Maybe stand up.
Yeah, you
Sure.
can turn around too. There's a microphone.
Sorry,
for
my
you.
voice doesn't carry very well. A passion for me is using psychosynthesis in a business application and as a effective tool to assist change agents in igniting innovation in the world today. And I think I don't know what you both think, but I think there is a resurgence of consciousness as human capital being not unlike what you maybe saw in the 60s, just with a very different coding now. And so I'd like to know what either of you think about psychosynthesis as the theory and practice to assist changing in larger organizations and in the business community. If there's anyone that you could turn me on to, like I know there's Patricia Aberdeen who speaks in favor of it. And so if either of you have any thoughts on that, I'd be happy to scratch them down.
Well, it's interesting. I think that's right, that there's a resurgence of interest in consciousness, but in a different context. Because the explosion in the 60s was expansive. And it was the further reaches of human nature. It was out, it was opening up all the unconscious, opening up all these realms that had been closed down. I think that the hunger now is for a consciousness that's embedded in ordinary life and expressed in action. And all the wisdom is still needed, but the direction of the expansion is an entirely different direction. And so that if people are still teaching the kind of up and out, people just aren't interested in that. The next generation is facing real planetary problems, real national problems, and they want solutions, but they want the solutions that come from the deepest place possible, the most mature place. So I think if you think about the resurgence of consciousness in that context, it's all of it's needed, but the context is completely different, almost opposite. You know, you have to have transcendence in order to descend, so to speak. But the emphasis really is on action, practicality, expression within a real world problems. And you see kids, they're not interested in going to a meditation retreat, but they'll march against a pipeline. You know, or like 350.org is filled with young people, and Bill McKibben has this wonderful group of young people who are just totally committed to bringing consciousness to climate change and changing it. But they're doing it through the media, and they're doing it through protest, and they're not going to ashrams.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is that people really want to hear things that matter to them, you know, on a personal level. Like, we're talking about various aspects of ourselves. Well, I made a mention to this when we were in Canada about wellness. Like, true wellness means, you know, spirituality, your physical, your environment. You know, wellness includes like 8 dimensions. It's not just physical health or going to a spa and getting a massage. It's really the well-being of the person. So I think if we speak to people in the areas that matter to them, you know, I think we're going to be able to reach them.
Thanks. Anybody else is going back there? Michael.
This is what emerged for me, and I've thought about. This is what emerged for me, and I've thought about this a lot. Is that the 2 explosions in psychotherapy right now is IFS, internal family systems, and basically the subpersonality system, and also mindfulness, which is coming from John Kabat-Zinn. Like, they're exploded into the therapy world. And what I was thinking as you were talking, some of the differences is that John Kabat-Zinn is sort of the authoritative initiator, and then it comes down from him, or Dick Schwartz is it comes down from IFS. So I'm wondering, also this is probably a question with you, Tom, but also you, Angel, is that originally when you had that breakup, it used to be hierarchical, and now psychosynthesis is more, it feels like, autonomous in different satellites, and I wonder if that's like what makes it hard, because we've already done mindfulness and subpersonalities, and so I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts and comments about that.
Well, yeah, and that's actually something I wanted to mention. In that early period, the other thing that happened with psychosynthesis was that people from different disciplines, including transpersonal psychology, which was our competitor, in some ways took advantage of our weakness and stole our ideas. And we were upset about that. But Frank Aronian, who was actually one of the first generation, he came to the last Summer Institute and died a few months afterwards. He said, you know, Roberto would be so happy about what's happening. And we said, what? He said, yeah, because all the ideas he cared about are in the culture.
Right.
So, you know, John Kabat-Zinn obviously drew on Buddhism, but Richard Schwartz definitely drew on, he admitted at first he doesn't, but he drew on psychosynthesis.
Right.
But, you know, there've been almost trauma work was the lower unconscious. Positive psychology is the superconscious, so forth and so on. So, and that's not that psychosynthesis is special, it's just comprehensive. Or as Esther Jolie said to Sam Keen, the limit of psychosynthesis is it has no limits. So in terms of the future though, Michael, I think, and Angelo said this, I think there can be a unified center that is not built around an individual. I think it can be built around a coherent set of ideas that a group of people embrace and work and differentiate and offer. And I actually think that is the more timely model now. Somebody told me that all science is done in teams now. And when a graduate student goes to study biology, they're put on a team immediately, because it's so complex now that one person can't do it. So I think there could be, in that sense, a team of people who took psychosynthesis and in a coherent way created what you mentioned. It was a wonderful word for it.
Unified force.
Yeah, unified force. But it's just fine that there's not a strong individual. I think that's a limitation actually now.
And we even have somebody from the fashion industry, so. Marjorie Consulting. Let's pop back over to this side for a minute. Somebody had a hand, was it you, Val?
Yeah, just real briefly, when you talked about how do we connect it to what's going on right now, I've just been working at Hampshire College, and this semester there was this uprising in the college, and the campus got closed down for a couple of days. People were really angry around two issues. One of them was racism, and one of them was sexual assault that wasn't being addressed in the way that they thought. And I did a lot of thinking about what is this, right? And it's national, right? It's not just at that college. This is going on nationally at this point. And I think about how can we as psychosynthesists bring what we have in terms of our sense of the core self and the witness, the open, non-judgmental witness self, and our active will, our ability to really help us understand how to understand our subpersonalities as a culture, not just as individuals, but as a culture, right? We have a core self as a culture, and we are acting out our subpersonalities, right? So we have a prison industrial complex, which is massive and really fucked up, because it is so predominantly people of color, men of color. And I was looking up the numbers in preparation for this talk today. I was shocked, right? So what are the issues of today that we can bring? I think that we have to focus on our own healing individually and on the healing of the culture, and recognize that it's a microcosm, macrocosm situation.
That's what I was saying. Is that we need to look at
Just
the
like
things
he said.
that are relevant to people today. And how can psychosynthesis go in there and harmonize it? I agree.
Anybody else? We have time for one or two more. If there's some other questions, over to Pamela.
Angel, I just felt very moved by your speaking to the places that are the hardest in ourselves are the places of strength. And I just think that that's so important for all of us to keep in the forefront, because that really is where the movement needs to stem from that you're talking about. It's really powerful. And I appreciate your willingness to say that.
Yeah, you good, Dee Dee? Barbara.
And on that note, I guess this is the second time that I've heard about what happened in San Francisco, and I would love at some point to have more conversation about that, so that as there's a new movement happening, perhaps, and new energy coming, that whatever distortions happened or got triggered, if that was an egoic movement, it was Shakti, or the energy of release from tapping into deep spiritual energy. I think that would be also really important to mine for. Not for painful, shaming, blaming thing, but for what can be learned going forward, so those same things don't happen. Because I do sense that it can get really exciting when you're creating something new, and I also know that if we're not careful, that could have also a negative piece. And so that's one piece. The other is I'm curious about who, as this unifying force, and the commonality around terms, because as I went to the conference in Montreal, there was even a wide spectrum of difference around people, how they talked about self. And so that's, still really, I think, really relevant to talk about how we might get unified, and where's the authority in the end going to come from to make decisions about this is the package or this is the brand, what exactly is okay and what's not okay. And those, again, as Angel, you spoke to this, those might be really hard and messy kind of calls. And I just think we're all going to really need a lot of tenderness and self-compassion as we go through that, because that could be difficult. So anyway, I just want to raise that. If you have anything to speak to on that, I think.
And in terms of your first thing, in the book that was published several years ago, The History of Psychosynthesis in North America, there's a chapter on the San Francisco group, which I wrote, and Anne and Mark helped me initially with it. And that has quite a clear statement. I'm not saying we shouldn't do what you're talking about, but there is published material on that episode that you can read.
Great, thanks.
And also Mark Horowitz's book.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Yeah.
there's a picture. Read Mark's book, The Dance of We, because he actually refers to a lot of what went wrong and some of the lessons that are being learned from it to this day. But one of the things you mentioned, the unifying force, and I think something that you've always presented in all the trainings I've ever been aware of is maintaining the diversity while you go for that unity.
Right.
San Francisco had a problem of trying to go for too much unity, I think. And yet, on the other hand, sometimes in more recent years, there's been so much diversity, it's become fragmented. So there's that both and that we all want to seek, unity and the diversity. And it seems there's where our challenge is.
All right, on that note, Mark, did you want to just take a last
I just wanted to say something about the authority question.
Yeah.
Because I've been thinking about it lately, and my concern is that in moving forward, that we move away from experience, and that we move into theory. And that the authority that Roberto kept coming back to is what you experience, not what somebody calls the self or the higher self or that, because you can manufacture all of that, but what's your real authentic experience in the moment? That's the authority. And that should be the authority for the theory as we're going forward.
All right, thank you. On that note, we will conclude. Thank you both again for your time and thoughts and sharing.